I thought moving back home was the right thing to do after losing our parents, but I never expected what it would awaken between us. One night, I caught him staring at me, his eyes saying what words never could. It was just a moment, or so I told myself. But deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. When I moved back into the family home, I told myself it was to help Alex with the overwhelming burden of settling our parents' estate. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. My life had felt unmoored for years, failed relationships, a stagnant career, and a restless sense of not belonging anywhere. The house, with its sprawling gardens and weathered stone facade, felt like the last place I could find some sense of stability. Alex, my older brother by 3 years, had always been the dependable one. Even as kids, he was the anchor in our family, a steady hand that calmed storms. Now, at 31, he carried the weight of the estate with the same quiet strength. His grief was palpable, though he hid it well behind a composed exterior. He welcomed me back without hesitation, his hug firm, his voice low as he said, "It's good to have you here." We quickly fell into a routine. Mornings filled with paperwork and meetings with estate managers, afternoons spent walking the grounds, checking on repairs, and reminiscing about our parents. It was exhausting work, but Alex made it bearable with his dry humor and occasional moments of levity. He had a way of diffusing tension, of making even the heaviest days seem lighter. At first, it felt comforting, even healing, to be around him so much. The shared burden of grief and responsibility brought us closer, like the siblings we used to be. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing subtle shifts. The way his gaze lingered a moment too long during our conversations, the way his touch seemed more deliberate when he handed me a glass or brushed a stray hair from my face. They were fleeting moments, easy to dismiss as nothing. And yet they stayed with me, an uneasy hum beneath the surface of our otherwise normal lives. I tried to tell myself it was just grief, that we were leaning on each other in the way family should. But there was a part of me, a part one didn't want to name, that felt something more. The house that had once been a haven now felt charged with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls were holding secrets neither of us dared to confront. It started with little things, moments that seemed innocuous at first, but grew harder to ignore as they piled up. Alex had always been attentive, but now his gestures felt different, weighted. He'd pour me a glass of wine after dinner, his fingers brushing mine just slightly longer than necessary. When we talked, his eyes seemed to linger, scanning my face as if searching for something he couldn't quite name. I told myself it was all in my head, that we were simply two people navigating grief in our own ways. But doubt had already crept in, and it wasn't letting go. The house didn't help. Every corner held memories of our parents, echoes of a happier time when life felt less complicated. Walking through the hallways or sitting by the fire, I often caught myself lost in thought, only to find Alex watching me. He didn't look away when our eyes met. Instead, his gaze would hold steady, his expression unreadable. I convinced myself it was his way of making sure I was okay, that it was nothing more than concern. And yet, my heart would race in those moments, betraying me. The cracks deepened during an otherwise mundane evening. We were walking through the garden at sunset, the fading light casting everything in soft amber tones. I was mid-sentence, recounting a childhood story, when Alex stopped abruptly. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was gentle, but his fingers lingered, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. My breath caught, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. Then, as quickly as it happened, he stepped back, his hand dropping to his side as if nothing had occurred. But I couldn't unfeel it. That fleeting touch replayed in my mind over and over, weaving itself into my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to shake it. Each day brought more of these moments, small but significant. A quiet laugh shared over coffee, a glance held a beat too long, an accidental touch that left my skin tingling. They were subtle enough to excuse, but impossible to forget. I started noticing changes in myself, too. I was hyper-aware of his presence, of the way he moved through the house, or the sound of his voice in the next room. My reactions felt involuntary, my body betraying me with the way my heart quickened when he was near. It was a spiral I couldn't stop, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The final straw came late one night. I had just stepped out of the shower, my hair still damp, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Assuming it was Alex heading to bed, I didn't think much of it and stepped into the living room to grab a book I'd left on the coffee table. But he was there, standing by the window, his back to me. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, and for a moment, everything stilled. His eyes flicked over me briefly before settling on mine, his expression a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't place. The air between us felt heavy, thick with unspoken words. Sorry, he said, his voice quieter than usual. I didn't mean to. I'll go. No, I said quickly, my voice catching. It's fine. I left my book. He nodded but didn't move, his gaze lingering. The silence stretched, charged and unbearable. I clutched the edges of my towel, acutely aware of the tension in the room. Finally, he cleared his throat and stepped away, murmuring a quiet, "Good night." But as he walked past me, the space he left behind felt colder, emptier. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange, awkward encounter between siblings. But deep down I knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The days following that night were both unbearable and intoxicating. Every interaction with Alex felt like walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of something dangerous. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't even acknowledge it, but the tension between us was undeniable. It clung to the air, thick and unrelenting, like a storm waiting to break. We fell into a strange rhythm, one that felt both normal and anything but. Mornings were still filled with estate work, afternoons spent walking the grounds, but now, every shared glance or accidental touch seemed to crackle with unspoken meaning. I found myself looking forward to those moments, even as I feared them. The way his hand would brush against mine when passing a document, or the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. It all felt deliberate, even if I couldn't be sure. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alex suggested we share a drink in the library. It had become something of a ritual, a quiet way to wind down, but tonight felt different. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room, as we sat in our usual spots. I was curled up in an armchair, a glass of wine in hand, while Alex lounged on the couch, his tie loosened and his posture relaxed. We talked about nothing and everything, childhood memories, estate plans, the kind of small talk that felt safe. But as the evening wore on, the space between us seemed to shrink. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze lingering on my face, my hands, the curve of my shoulder where my sweater had slipped slightly. Each time, my heart raced, and I had to remind myself to breathe. Then it happened. A pause in the conversation, a silence that stretched just a moment too long. I looked up from my glass, and our eyes met. There was something in his expression I couldn't ignore, an intensity, a longing that made my breath catch. He opened his mouth as if to say something but closed it again, his jaw tightening. "Alex?" I asked softly, my voice barely more than a whisper. He hesitated, then set his glass down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he said finally, his voice low and raw. "Do what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "Pretend that everything's normal. That I don't feel this." The air seemed to leave the room. My chest tightened, and I gripped the edges of my blanket, unsure what to say. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I know it's wrong," he continued, his voice quieter now. "I've told myself 100 times that it's just grief, or loneliness, or some stupid, fleeting thing. But it's not. It's more than that. And I don't know how to stop feeling it." His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but I couldn't. Because the truth was, I felt it too. I had for weeks, maybe longer. And now, hearing him say it out loud, there was no denying it anymore. "Alex," I started, my voice trembling. "This isn't we can't." "I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I know we can't. But that doesn't make it go away." I looked down at my hands, my mind racing. This was a line we couldn't cross, a boundary that couldn't be broken. And yet, it already felt like we were standing on the other side of it. "I don't know what to do," I admitted finally, my voice barely audible. "I don't know how to stop feeling it either." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was deafening, the weight of our confessions pressing down on us. Then, slowly, Alex reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, tentative, but it sent a jolt through me, leaving my skin tingling in its wake. "We don't have to figure it out tonight," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging between us. "But we can't keep pretending, either." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, longing, and something else I couldn't name. All I knew was that things would never be the same. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed every moment in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had trembled with raw honesty, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to leave me breathless. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and completely, utterly forbidden. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, one thought remained. There was no going back. It was late one evening when everything came crashing down. The estate was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the stillness of the night. I was in the kitchen, putting away the last of the dishes from dinner, when Alex walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the doorframe, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Everything okay?" I asked, my voice deliberately light as I tried to ignore the way his presence made the air feel heavier. He didn't answer right away, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting mine. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice low but steady. My stomach tightened. Those 4 words carried a weight I wasn't sure I was ready to bear. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About us." I froze, the dish towel slipping from my fingers. I had spent weeks avoiding this conversation, convincing myself that if we didn't acknowledge it, the tension between us might somehow disappear. But now, faced with the reality of it, there was no escape. "Alex," I started, my voice trembling. "I don't think." "Please," he interrupted, stepping closer. "Just let me say this." I nodded reluctantly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I can't keep pretending," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not with you, not with myself. I've tried to push it down, to convince myself it's just grief or loneliness, but it's not. It's more than that. And I think you feel it too." His words hit me like a tidal wave, sweeping away the fragile walls I'd built around my emotions. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but I couldn't. Because he was right. I did feel it. I had for weeks, maybe longer. And no matter how much I tried to bury it, the truth was there, staring me in the face. "Alex," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is wrong." "I know," he said quickly, his expression pained. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel, either." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, longing, and something darker, something I couldn't name. "We can't," I said, my voice trembling. "We're family." "We're more than that," he said, stepping closer. "You know we are." I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "This isn't right." "Maybe not," he said softly. "But it's real. And I can't ignore it anymore." The room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words. I could feel him behind me, his presence a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. Slowly, I turned to face him, my breath hitching as our eyes met. The intensity in his gaze was undeniable, a raw honesty that left me exposed. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to stop feeling this." He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through me that left me breathless. "Maybe we don't have to stop," he said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe we just have to figure out how to live with it." Before I could respond, his hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle but firm. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. And then, before I could think or breathe or stop him, he kissed me. The world seemed to tilt, the ground shifting beneath my feet as his lips pressed against mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, the weight of weeks, months, of unspoken emotions pouring into that single stolen moment. When we finally pulled apart, reality crashed down around us. I stepped back, my hand flying to my mouth as I stared at him in shock. "I can't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I can't do this." His expression was a mix of longing and regret, his hand falling to his side. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to." "I have to go," I said quickly, cutting him off. Without another word, I turned and fled the room, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I lay awake, replaying the kiss in my mind. It had felt so right in the moment, so natural, but now all I could think about was how wrong it was. We had crossed a line, one we could never uncross. And yet, even as guilt consumed me, I couldn't deny the truth. I wanted more. The days that followed were a blur. Alex and I avoided each other as much as possible, the tension between us palpable. When we did cross paths, we barely spoke, our conversations reduced to clipped sentences and forced politeness. But the weight of what had happened hung over us, unspoken but impossible to ignore. It all came to a head one evening. We were alone in the library, the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. I was pretending to read, my eyes skimming the words on the page without absorbing them, when Alex spoke. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice breaking the silence like a clap of thunder. I looked up, my heart sinking at the pain in his expression. "I know," I said softly. "But I can't pretend it didn't happen," he continued. "And I can't pretend I don't want it to happen again." Tears filled my eyes as I closed the book and set it aside. "What are we supposed to do, Alex?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We can't just run away from this. From everything." "Maybe we don't have to run," he said, stepping closer. "Maybe we just have to figure out how to make it work." I shook my head, the tears spilling over. "This isn't just about us. It's about our family, our parents' legacy. We can't destroy everything they built because of this." "But what about us?" he asked, his voice raw. "What about how we feel?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were standing on the edge of something that could destroy us both. And yet, even as fear gripped me, I couldn't bring myself to let go. The kiss changed everything. It was as if the fragile thread holding our world together had snapped, leaving us scrambling to pick up the pieces. The days that followed were a mixture of avoidance and unbearable tension. We did our best to maintain the illusion of normalcy, especially when others were around, but behind closed doors, the weight of what had happened pressed down on us like a physical force. I could see it in Alex, the way his laughter never quite reached his eyes, the way he avoided my gaze when we were in the same room. It mirrored my own struggle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, felt the lingering heat of his touch, heard the whispered confessions that had shattered our carefully constructed walls. And every time the guilt clawed at me, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. The house, once a refuge, now felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to hold a memory of him, of us. The library where we'd stolen glances, the kitchen where his hand had lingered on mine, the garden where we'd shared quiet moments that had felt too intimate, even then. I couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him, and the harder I tried, the more I felt myself drawn to him. It all came to a head during one of our evening gatherings. Friends and distant relatives had come to the estate, filling the halls with laughter and conversation. On the surface, it was a celebration, a way to honor our parents' memory and the legacy they had left behind. But for Alex and me, it was a spotlight on the cracks we were desperately trying to hide. I found myself retreating to the garden, the noise of the party too much to bear. The cool night air was a welcome relief, but it did little to quiet the turmoil inside me. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and tried to steady myself. But when I opened them, Alex was there. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his tie slightly loosened. He looked as torn as I felt, his expression a mix of longing and regret. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "You needed a break too," he said finally, his voice low. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He stepped closer, and I felt my chest tighten. The space between us was too small, the tension too much. "This isn't working," he said quietly, his words cutting through the stillness like a knife. I looked away, my eyes falling to the ground as I fought to keep my emotions in check. "I know," I whispered. "But I don't know how to fix it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine. Not with them here. Not with us." I flinched at his words, the truth of them hitting me like a punch to the gut. "What do you want me to say, Alex?" I asked, my voice trembling. "That I don't feel it too? That it doesn't kill me every time I look at you?" His eyes softened, and he reached out, his fingers brushing mine before pulling back as if burned. "I'm not blaming you," he said, his voice gentle. We need to stop. Before it gets worse." "Stop what?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Talking? Laughing? Looking at each other? I don't even know what this is anymore." "It's everything," he said softly, his voice raw. "And that's the problem." Tears pricked at my eyes, and I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could hold myself together. "Do you think I don't know that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Do you think I don't feel the same way? That I don't lie awake every night wondering how the hell we ended up here?" His silence was answer enough. I wiped at my eyes, forcing myself to look at him. "I love you," I said, the words tasting both sweet and bitter. "But we can't do this. Not like this." He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of my words. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice laced with desperation. I took a shaky breath, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "We take a step back," I said finally. "We stop letting this, whatever it is, control us. We focus on the estate, on the family, on anything else. We put distance between us." "And if that doesn't work," he asked, his voice raw. "Then we figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "But for now we have to try." The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that pressed down on you like a physical force. Finally, Alex nodded, his jaw tight as he looked at me. Okay, he said. If that's what you need. It's what we both need, I said, though my heart felt like it was breaking with every word. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached out and brushed a stray tear from my cheek, his touch lingering for just a moment before he pulled away. You're stronger than you think, he said softly. Stronger than me. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was barely holding on. But I didn't. Instead, I watched as he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the garden with nothing but the sound of the wind and the ache in my chest. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, each step deliberate, each moment steeped in careful restraint. Alex and I kept our promise, or at least we tried. We avoided being alone together, kept our conversations brief and impersonal, and threw ourselves into the work of maintaining the estate. On the surface, it seemed like we had regained some semblance of control. But beneath the facade, the truth lingered, heavy and inescapable. At first, the distance was excruciating. Every time he walked into the room, my heart ached with the weight of everything unsaid. I caught myself glancing his way, searching for some sign that he felt the same, even as I knew the answer. And when our eyes met, it was like a spark, brief but powerful, igniting emotions I was desperate to bury. But slowly, things began to shift. The overwhelming tension between us eased, replaced by something softer, something quieter. The shared glances became less frequent, the accidental touches fewer and farther between. It wasn't that the feelings had disappeared, far from it, but we had learned to contain them, to lock them away in the corners of our hearts where they couldn't hurt us, or anyone else. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing on the terrace, gazing out at the gardens. The estate was beautiful, bathed in the warm glow of twilight, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Alex joined me, his footsteps soft against the stone. He stood beside me, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. It's getting easier, he said, his voice low. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the horizon. It is. I didn't think it would, he admitted. But it is. There was a sadness in his tone, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had lost. Not just our parents, but the version of ourselves we had been before grief and longing had tangled us in something we couldn't control. I think we'll be okay, I said softly, though the words felt heavy on my tongue. Eventually. He turned to me, his expression thoughtful. You really believe that? I have to, I said, my voice steady. For both of us. We stood there in silence, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't been able to see before. Love, in all its forms, was complicated. It didn't fit neatly into the boundaries society had drawn. But love, when it crossed those boundaries, came at a cost. A cost I wasn't willing to pay. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. The estate became my focus, a place where I could channel my energy, my grief, my hopes for something better. Alex, too, seemed to find a sense of purpose. We worked side by side, not as two people consumed by forbidden feelings, but as siblings united by a shared goal. The feelings never disappeared entirely. They lingered like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness, a reminder of what could never be. But I learned to live with them, to accept them as part of who I was. They didn't define me, they didn't define us. They were just there, a part of our story, but not the whole of it. In time, the tension faded. We found a rhythm, a way of being together that felt healthy, sustainable. We laughed more, talked more, found joy in the small things. And though there were moments when the past threatened to resurface, we held firm, grounded by the knowledge that we had chosen a different path, a better path. As I stood in the garden one evening, watching the stars blink into existence, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The choices we had made weren't easy, but they were necessary. And in the end, they brought us closer, not in the way we had once imagined, but in a way that felt right. Because sometimes love means letting go, not of the person, but of the things that could destroy you both. And in that letting go, we found a way to move forward, not as two people defined by what might have been, but as two people choosing to honor what was and what could still be. If you were in their position, could you have walked away? Or would the pull of forbidden feelings be too strong to resist? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. And stay tuned. Next time, we'll uncover a secret so shocking, it will leave you questioning everything.